Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. All right, hello True Drews, and welcome to episode 4 of the True Drew Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about The Hidden Staircase, which is the second book in the Nancy Drew series. Also, I hope you all are having a good November so far. We're only a few days in, but the weather has gotten decidedly colder here in East Tennessee, and I have not given up my iced coffee yet. I'm actually, as we're recording this, enjoying a blueberry cobbler iced coffee from Dunkin'. So good. But yeah, I don't know. Is there a proper time to transition to hot coffee? Because I feel like I always drink iced coffee, but I'm just asking for a friend. I did want to take a quick second too to say thank you all for the sweet comments and messages about my costume that I did for Halloween. I had so much fun dressing up as Nancy from Secret of the Old Clock. I just had such a good time at that party that I went to, and everybody got it. They were like, "Ah, you're Nancy Drew." It was very obvious. I mean, I had the magnifying glass. I'm carrying a clock around. But that was so fun. I haven't really gotten to dress up the last couple years for Halloween, so it was so fun to not only get to dress up, but dress up as one of my favorite characters of all time. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to jump right into The Hidden Staircase. This is actually a cult favorite for a lot of people, I think. It's such a wild book. There's so many funny things that happen in this book, but also it's one of the most adapted Nancy Drew books into movies and TV show episodes, which I found really interesting because while I do love this book a little bit more than Secret of the Old Clock, the book that we reviewed last episode, I wouldn't say that it's one of my ultimate favorites. It's definitely in my top 10, but probably not in my top 5. This book also happens to have one of the most iconic and recognizable Nancy Drew covers of all time. I feel like most of the time when we think of Nancy Drew, we either think of Secret of the Old Clock or The Hidden Staircase, or there may be a couple other covers that stick out to us, but this cover is probably one of my favorites. So the original illustrator was Russell Tandy, and this book came out in 1930 as well. And it looks like in the first iteration of this cover, we have Nancy again in the cloche hat. She's again wearing blue. She's got like this yellowish brown duster jacket on, and she's peering up the steps with a flashlight. I know I grew up with the 1960s and 1970s cover versions for the Nancy Drew books, but I really love these 1930s covers. They're so vivid and just well imagined, and I just love the silhouettes of the clothing that Nancy wears, and I feel like the illustrators did a really good job of depicting Nancy in these earlier covers. Now, the second version of the cover for The Hidden Staircase, I had actually never seen this cover, and I believe it's from the 40s or 50s. But we see Nancy with Aunt Rosemary and Miss Flora, and it looks like she's in the attic, and she's crouched down and pointing through an open panel on the wall. And one of the sisters is holding a candlestick. And Nancy has the golden blonde hair here, and more of a 50s silhouette for her clothing. And the last version of the Hidden Staircase cover is the one that I grew up with, and it shows Nancy with red, short hair. She's again looking up the staircase like she was in the original cover, and she's again wearing blue skirt, blue shirt. She loves a monochromatic look, but she's got the flashlight pointing up the stairs, and there's a bunch of creepy cobwebs around. I've got to say, I love these covers. Probably the one that I like the least is, again, the second cover. I don't know what it was, but I didn't like the second cover of Secret of the Old Clock either. But I would still give the main covers, the one from the 1930s and the one from the 1960s, a score of 5 magnifying glasses because it's so iconic. This is what we think of when we think of Nancy. She's holding a flashlight. She's exploring a secret passageway. I mean, what more could you want? I also feel like a lot of people cite this as being one of their favorite Nancy Drew books, probably because, and I could be wrong about this, but it's Nancy's second mystery. She's kind of getting into the groove of things, and Helen Corning, her friend, invites her to solve this mystery, and it's starting to feel like Nancy is getting known for her crime-solving skills, and so that's really cool. So I came up with a spoof for this cover because I think it's fun to do these, but if I had looked at this book and never seen the title, I would probably give this the name of The Case of Who Signed Me Up for Cardio. because Nancy's like peering up this huge staircase, and while it's not 99 steps, foreshadowing, it's still a pretty steep staircase, but I think Nancy's up for it. She like jumps out of boats, she climbs the sides of houses. She's well equipped for the cardio that it requires. Now, we've talked a little bit about the cover, and I thought I would read a brief synopsis, or the most brief synopsis that I could come up with, of what happens in this book. Nancy receives a call from her friend Helen Corning about a supposed ghost plaguing her Aunt Rosemary's estate, Twin Elms, and accepts the case. Shortly after hanging up, a man named Nathan Gomber comes calling and threatens Nancy, saying her father is in danger in regards to a railroad settlement he took on. Nancy and her father are nearly mowed down by a truck before splitting ways to work separate cases. Aunt Rosemary and Miss Flora have been harassed by hauntings at Twin Elms. Lights flickering, radios turning on, and stolen jewelry. After Nancy and Helen arrive at Twin Elms, none other than Nathan Gomber shows up, wanting to buy it. The aunts refuse to sell, and later Helen is terrified by a gorilla mask at the window, an owl gets in the house, and then the girls have an impromptu colonial costume party. Meanwhile, Carson has gone missing, and Nancy hears something from a taxi driver that suggests he was abducted. Nathan Gomber coerces Aunt Flora into selling Twin Elms, and Nancy discovers hidden passageways. She soon finds her dad in one of the passageways and is able to nab the bad guys and disprove the hauntings. Now, the characters in this book include Nancy herself, there's Helen Corning, Nancy's best friend, Carson Drew, Nancy's father, Hannah Gruen, who is their housekeeper, and then there are the aunts of Helen Corning, Flora Turnbull and Rosemary Hayes, and then of course we have Nathan Gomber, the overzealous guy who's trying to buy Twin Elms from the aunts. I also came up with a newspaper headline synopsis that kind of just ties it all together, but I just came up with hauntings are fake, so-called specter at local mansion apprehended by teen detective. Also, can we talk for a second about how cool Nancy's job is? Like, she doesn't make any money. She never accepts payment for any of these mysteries that she solves. She will pick up little trinkets. Like, I believe in Secret of the Old Clock, she got the clock itself, but she never accepts payment for these jobs. And while it is cool, I guess her dad foots the bill for everything because she's still technically 18 in these books, but she has such a cool job. So I actually found this book really enjoyable to read, but I did take down some notes on some direct quotes and things that I noticed because, again, like we said in the last episode, since these books were written in the 30s and then revised in the 60s and 70s, there's quite a lot of differences just in the way that men and women interacted, how people viewed marriage and other societal norms at the time, so it's pretty interesting. So the first thing that I took note of is the fact that Nancy goes on a date with someone named Dirk, who was a tennis champion in high school. Like, apparently this is his claim to fame. He's a tennis champion, ex-tennis champion at River Heights High School. But there's a part where Nancy's talking to her dad, Carson, and Carson said that Dirk doesn't like to be kept waiting. And Nancy later mentions after the date how lucky she was to have Dirk as a date. This whole part, I was just like, no. If he doesn't like to be kept waiting, then, like, that's just so, I know this was, like, revised in the 60s, but I was just like, he can keep waiting. And, I mean, Nancy, like, groveling like that, like, oh, I was so lucky to go on a date with Dirk, the tennis champion. I'm just like, girl, set your standards a little bit higher, because that ain't it. And also, I know Ned hasn't even been mentioned yet. He comes in to play later in the next few books, I think. We'll see when that happens. But yeah, I'm glad she held out for Ned and dumped Dirk because he sounds like a loser. So the next thing that I took note of was the fact that Nancy and Carson have to jump in a river to avoid being run over by that truck, which I mentioned in the synopsis. But basically, they go down to where they're working on this railroad bridge project thing, and Nancy and Carson both notice about the same time that this truck is rolling down the hill towards them with nobody in the driver's seat. And so I think Carson just yells, dive, and they jump into the water to avoid it. And then they come out like soaking wet, and Carson's helping Nancy get her shoes out of the mud. But it's just really intense. I was like, wow, I think I'd be terrified if that were to happen to me, but yeah. Also, I thought it was a little odd that Helen got proposed to over the phone. So Nancy's friend, Helen Corning, is apparently talking to this guy named Jim Archer, and I guess he's a banker, or he works overseas doing something, I can't remember, but she gets proposed to by him over the phone, and she's telling Nancy about it, and Nancy, she stops her car, and she's excited, and she's hugging Helen, but I have to wonder, in the back of her mind, is she just wow, Helen, over the phone, couldn't he just, I know he's overseas, but it doesn't really seem super romantic, but whatever, it was a different time, but that was definitely interesting and caught my attention. I also think that, at least in the revised editions, Harriet definitely used Helen as the antithesis of Nancy in a way. She was very, it seems like depicting, Helen's going down this other path to get married and going to holy matrimony, and then you've got Nancy over here, and while she has no shortage of dates with people like Dirk, and she obviously has a busy social calendar, she's not looking to jump into marriage just yet. I think later in one of the books she says she's married to mystery or something like that, but it's very interesting that we kind of get this view of what Nancy's life could have been like. She could have gotten married and like Helen and proposed to over the phone. So this next part of my notes, I kind of get the feeling I know at least partially why they revised some of these books, but Twin Elms was built in 1785 is what it says in the book, and they refer to these servants' cottages. So I think in the original, I don't know if the dates were changed. I think it was something that had to do with the Civil War, but come on, they definitely weren't servants' cottages. It was definitely a place where the slaves were most likely kept and where they stayed. And so I don't know. I don't know why these books have such a problem with just telling it like it is. I mean, they say some other things just point blank, but I know some people weren't ready to talk about that like we are today, but I just found that kind of disappointing. So this was something that I noticed early on in the book, and it really annoyed me. But Nathan Gomber, the guy who's trying to purchase Twin Elms from Helen's aunts, loves to talk in third person. He just, at one point, he's like, "You can't pull one over on the great Nathan Gomber." Just who does that? That should have been the red flag right there. He's talking about himself in third person. He's got to be the villain. There's another super weird scene in this book where Nathan Gomber waxes poetic about being from Europe and wanting a traditional colonial house because he wants to be, quote, more American. And Aunt Flora says he's pathetic, and it makes sense that he wants to be more American. I thought this was so weird. I thought, really? He's obviously trying to get in her good graces and get her to sell the house. So he's obviously trying to speak her language. But the fact that she says he's pathetic and that, it makes sense that he wants to be more American and own this old colonial home where, who knows, unspeakable things have happened. But it was so odd. That part, I was like, they could have just taken this out. This is so weird. My next note that I have down, I just wrote down floating island dessert. And so apparently when Nancy and Helen are there at Twin Elms, they eat this floating island dessert. And I was like, I've never heard of this. It's probably something that's really dated and old fashioned. So of course I Googled it. And what I came up with was it's a meringue in custard sauce. And it didn't look completely bad. I was like, okay, I might try that. It kind of looked like flan, or maybe I don't know, that, what is that cake? It's called dulce de leche cake. It looked a lot like that. So I don't know. Floating island dessert. Just kind of an interesting name. Also, is it flan? Flan? It's gyro. There's so many foods that I don't know how to pronounce. I'm sorry. So another thing I noticed in the book was the ageism that's just rampant, but the police won't believe two older women, Aunt Rosemary and Aunt Flora, but they will believe Nancy and Helen. Which I'm like, I know they're saying that their house is haunted, but as the police, you should probably want to dig a little bit deeper and, come to the conclusion that, well, obviously it's not a haunting. There's somebody doing this to these poor, women. So I don't know. I thought it was weird that the police were like, no, y'all are crazy. They're just depicted as the crazy older women. And then when Nancy and Helen step in and they're like, no, it's really happening. Then the police are like, oh, there must be something to this because these young whippersnappers have said that it's true. So I don't know. It's a little weird. Also, there's a super strange scene in this book where, and I have a feeling this is all Harriet Stratmeyer's doing, but they have like a little costume party. They go up to the attic because Aunt Flora and Aunt Rosemary have been telling Helen and Nancy, oh, there's these old, dresses and waistcoats and stuff up in the attic and we'll go get them out. And so they dress up and I think Nancy calls Helen, like they call each other Mr. and Miss Colonial America. It's so weird, but they're all dancing around in their outfits and stuff. And then of course there's another haunting, and so they run out, and the police, the guard that they've hired to patrol the grounds, is just like, what on earth? Why are y'all dressed like you're from the 18th century? It was a little bit funny though, because they talk about doing dance moves, and they reference it as like dance moves that they wouldn't have done back in colonial times. And so I'm just picturing them doing like the hustle or like something, I don't know, something that would have been popular at that time. So another term that they reference in the book is crinkle ear. They use it as an identifier for one of the bad guys. And I knew that was probably cauliflower ear, but it's basically a term from boxing. Usually when someone has been boxed in the ear, they get this it just looks crinkly, I guess, but they use that as an identifier for one of the bad guys, which I found kind of odd. So this next term that stuck out to me in the book that I could probably actually see myself using was necessary marketing. And Nancy talks about going to the market to shop, and she says, oh, I'm going to go do some necessary marketing. And it just sounded so weird. It sounded like now it would probably be in terms of like, oh, I have to market things for my business, but necessary marketing because you're going to the market. Thought that was kind of cool. Now, I didn't get to do as much with this last episode, but I wanted to do a segment called What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. And Hannah actually cooked quite a few dishes in this book, so I thought I would share some of the things that she made. At one point, Hannah makes orange and grape sherbet with fruit for Carson and Nancy, and she also makes spring lamb with mushrooms and rice. And both of these things sound way more appetizing than some of the dishes that were in the previous book, but I think it's so fascinating. Like, I just wonder if Hannah just comes up with these recipes off the top of her head, or if she's actually going by a cookbook. So we're now at the part of the podcast where we talk about the things that Nancy does in this book, the skills that she has. So the add that to your resume section. I put down domestic goddess because Nancy, for some reason, goes on a cleaning spree with Helen during the middle of the book. It's so funny. You can tell that this is part of the revisions that Harriet did, because Nancy, under Harriet's supervision, it seems like she's mostly like more preoccupied with her clothing and the way she looks, which, is fine. But she also, I feel like Harriet's trying to tell people like, oh, well, Nancy can still cook and she can still clean and do all this stuff. So, but yeah, they just start cleaning Twin Elms for no reason. It has no, it doesn't forward the plot in any way. So I also put down that one of Nancy's other skills from this book was she's a hidden passageway discoverer, because she's over there like knocking on the wall and finding like hollow spots. And like, I've always wanted to do this in real life and like find a secret passageway. I mean, who doesn't? But that's definitely something you should put on your resume. Just like, oh yeah, I can find all kinds of hidden passageways in old colonial homes. It's no big deal. Also, the entire name of this book, The Hidden Staircase, was kind of a dead giveaway because, I mean, we're going to find, we knew at some point, a hidden staircase, a hidden passageway. So, spoiler alert. I also took the time to write down some of the things that I liked from this book and some of the things that I didn't like. So, for the first thing that I liked from this book, Nancy and Helen's teamwork. They work really hard together to figure out who's behind these hauntings, and I really like that. And I like that there's no animosity between them because, as you'll see in some of the later books, when Bess and George come into the picture, Bess and George are constantly bickering, and that's kind of their thing. But I love that Nancy and Helen worked together and they were able to nab the bad guys. I also really love the fact that these people were trying to buy Twin Elms and they went to such extreme measures and did all these creepy things to scare everyone. I mean, the laughter in the stairwell was really freaky, I'll admit that. But the gorilla mask, I was like, really? Like, how random? I don't know. But, I mean, it definitely scared Helen because in the book, she, like, faints and, like, falls in a chair. And everyone comes downstairs and they're like, what happened, Helen? And she's like, there in the window, there's a gorilla mask. And, I mean, I guess I can kind of see why the police didn't believe them. It's just so funny, too, because it's like nowadays people would just go on Zillow and they'd be like, oh, this house isn't for sale. I'll just go look for another one. But if we didn't, have these hauntings, we wouldn't have this book. So it makes sense. But just the effort they went to get this house was a lot. The last thing that I really liked about this book was, of course, the hidden passageways. This is the first time that we see Nancy finding a hidden passageway, and it will not be the last. There will be several other times over the course of the series where she finds all kinds of crazy hidden things. But I thought it was really cool. It was neat that these two houses, Twin Elms, because there's a neighboring property that looks identical to the first mansion, how they're connected. And apparently there's some speculation on what those tunnels were used for, but obviously the villains wanted both of the properties so they could use them for nefarious purposes. Now on to the things that I didn't like about the hidden staircase. Honestly, I've got to go with Nathan Gomber. He was just such a jerk. The way that he tried to manipulate these two older women to sell their property, and the fact that he talked in third person the entire time, like that should have been the biggest dead giveaway that he was the villain. But he just if this person was a real person, I would not want to spend any time with them. So he was probably one of the biggest things that I didn't like about this book. So the last thing that I really didn't like about the hidden staircase was probably the elder abuse, because not only do Flora and Rosemary encounter so much incredulous speculation from the police. They don't believe them about the fact that they're being terrorized in their own home. But then you have Carson, who's literally kidnapped. I mean, these property owners that are against this railroad bridge project are so intent on stopping it that they kidnap this attorney and then they hide him in this passageway underneath this house. It's just so crazy. And when Nancy finds Carson, he's like on death's doorstep. He's literally like coughing and he hasn't eaten in days and he's been drugged and shoved into a taxi to get there in the first place. And it's bad. That part was very, like, I know it's just a book, but it was kind of uncomfortable to read. It makes you really upset and mad on Nancy's behalf, too, because it's like she's already lost her mom and now she almost loses her dad in the second book. And these criminals, like, between the gorilla mask and then kidnapping Carson, I was like, this is too much. I would say that overall, The Hidden Staircase is a really good book. I did enjoy reading it, where there's some of these books that are a little harder to get through. But the plot was good, and other than the random, like, colonial costume party and some of the stranger things in this book, it was pretty good. I am, however, still going to give it a 3 magnifying glasses rating out of 5, because I know that there's better books, and I feel like this one is good, and I can see why it's a fan favorite, but it's still not as good as some of the books that I remember being my favorites. So yeah, that is the episode for The Hidden Staircase. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you like this book, I hope you will take the time to revisit and reread it, because it is pretty entertaining to read. So next week's episode is going to be about the bungalow mystery, so I hope you all will tune in next Thursday, and if you have time, reread the book with me, and I will see you all then. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. You can follow along on Instagram at True Drew Podcast to see the latest information about new episodes.